Hello everyone, Katarina here. I have another card video for you today. In my last video I told you I will be showing you a quicker way to do watercoloring. For this card in this video I will be using the same stamp set with the rose as I used the last time, except of the sentiment, and I also will be using the same markers. This card will be for Mother's Day. I will be using the sentiment Happy Mother's Day from the All Occasion Sentiments by Cleary Besotted. On this card I will be stamping only one flower. This is actually the first thing that will speed up the coloring process. Less is faster. I wanted also to put a frame around the flower and already pre-cut the frame from a black cardstock using the wonky stitch square dies from My Favorite Things. Since I was stamping only once directly onto the card base, I decided to use the Mini Misty just to eliminate any mistakes. And you will see later in this video that this was actually a good decision. To be sure I stamp exactly where the frame will be, I used the frame as a guide to place the stamp in the Misty and closed the door and picked up the stamp. This time I will be heat embossing using a fine embossing powder, which is the next way of speeding up the coloring process. In this jar I have actually anti-static powder. I emptied the powder from my EK Success powder tool just because it didn't put any powder onto the paper, and this actually works way better, for me at least. It's much better than the powder tool or the powder bag. To add the powder to the paper I used a fluffy brush. I showed this one in my previous crafty haul video. I picked a bit of powder with the brush and added it to the paper, and then brushed it through the area where I will be stamping. Then I applied the Versamark ink onto the stamp and closed the door. Although I cleaned the stamp before using it again, you could still see some dark places on the card, but this doesn't matter since I will be adding a white embossing powder on top of it, which will cover the dark lines anyway. I stamped twice to make sure I get a good result, especially in the middle of the stamp image. I mentioned in my last video that I had problems getting good results with this stamp. In the center of the image there were lines missing. Even stamping twice didn't really help this time. The powder wasn't sticking in the middle. Luckily I still had the stamp in my Misty, so what I did, I brushed off the powder, put it back into the Misty and restamped another 3 times. Then I added the embossing powder again, and this time it turned out much better. When heat embossing I use a wooden cutting board, since my craft mat is not heat resistant. I heated up the heat gun for a few seconds before bringing it to the paper. The idea behind it is to avoid the warping of the paper. It doesn't work really with my heat gun. I'm using a heat gun from Paper Mania and it wasn't too expensive. Maybe that's the problem, it's not the best heat gun you can get. I used the purple color Zig marker again on this flower. If you didn't watch my previous video, the Zig markers I own don't have the brush tip, just 2 felt tips in different sizes on each side. I scribbled it on an acrylic block, added a little bit of clear water so I don't have to be reaching for the cup with a clear water I had on the side. Since the images were heat embossed, it was much easier to add the watercolor. I didn't need to be super careful, especially in the middle of the flower. The application was quite fast compared to the card in my last video. Again, I didn't care about the shading, I just was trying to apply different intensity of the color on each petal to make it more interesting. I started with the same brush as I did in my previous video, but then I decided to use a bigger brush and this made the application of the color even faster. My card base is just regular heavyweight cardstock. It's not a watercolor paper, so I had to be careful how much water I'm adding. I did another card the other day using proper watercolor paper with heat embossing, and again it helped to speed up the process once again. For the leaves, I just added the color without doing anything special. My first idea in my last card was to start darker on the bottom of the leaf and bring the color up, but then I decided I just keep it simple and easy, just spread the color around the leaves. I will speed up the coloring process and play a little bit of music to show you the whole process, and we'll be back to show you how I finished the card. The coloring took about 8 minutes. In my previous video, it took an hour, maybe even more. Not sure, I counted the coloring of the leaves. I know I colored 7 flowers, but I think if I used heat embossing, it would take a little bit less time, maybe 20 minutes less. So before I added the black frame, I stamped the sentiment first. I used the VersaFine Onyx black ink and stamped twice. For some reason, I either use my sleeve to press on the door of the Misty, and if I'm not wearing anything long sleeved, I just use a cloth. I also decided to use a clear embossing powder for the sentiment to match with the embossing of the rose. Then I adhere the frame. I used a foam tape, cut out thinner pieces and adhere them along the frame and attached it to the card base. I think this brings a little bit more dimension to the card and makes it a little bit more interesting. Lastly, I adhered few sequins onto the card. I was using sequins mixes from Neat and Tangled. I decided to use some clear sequins and also purple sequins in different shades and sizes. To adhere them, I used the multi-medium matte glue from Ranger. Here is the finished card. I think the black frame is quite a good idea if your stamp will not cover the whole front of the card. And again, I love the different intensity of the color on each petal, just like in my last card. Just to compare, here is the card from my last video. I think they turned up quite pretty and not sure which one I like more. They both look very nice. I hope you guys like this video as well. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to see more images of the finished card or my tips of speeding up the coloring process, I will have them listed over on my blog if you're interested. My website is cherry-b.net. Here is the list of the supplies. You can also find it in the description down below, as well as over on my blog. On my blog, for most of the products, I will also add the links to the shops where you can buy them. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future videos. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram and Pinterest, or over on my blog. All the links I included in the description down below. Just click show more to see all the details. Also check out my last video I made using the exact supplies, just in different way. And I will see you in my next video. Bye!